Empire of Blood. Episode 7. The death of one man is a tragedy. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Empire. 1924 to 1953. A production of Empire of Blood. The letter arrives on a Tuesday in February 1932, and the woman who opens it already knows what it says. Her name is Anya Voronova. She is 34 years old, the wife of a factory machinist in Leningrad, the mother of 2 children, a boy of 8 named Pyotr, a girl of 5 named Masha. She lives with her husband Dmitry and her mother-in-law in 2 rooms of a 6-family kommunalka on Ligovsky Prospect, a communal apartment where the kitchen is shared by 4 families and the toilet is shared by everyone, and the walls carry the sounds of 6 different lives pressed together by the housing shortage that the revolution promised to solve and has not. The building was once the property of a merchant family. The merchant family is gone. Exactly where is not a question Anya permits herself to think about. The letter is from the District Committee of the People's Commissariat for Food Supply. It is formally written in the bureaucratic Russian that has become the language of authority in the Soviet state. Dense with acronyms and ideological formulas and the passive voice constructions that allow official documents to announce catastrophic consequences without attaching them to any identifiable human decision. The letter informs Voronova AI that the grain quota assigned to her household has been recalculated based on the updated norms for the current period, and that the supplementary allocation previously attached to a husband's category of employment has been eliminated in accordance with the directive of the Central Committee dated January 7, 1932, and that henceforth the household will receive its monthly allocation from the designated distribution point upon presentation of the appropriate ration cards, and that any discrepancy between the allocation and the household's actual consumption requirements is to be addressed through the normal channels of the district committee. She reads it twice. Then she sets it on the kitchen table next to the metal pot she was heating water in and looks at the pot for a long time. The pot contains water and 2 potatoes. It was going to be lunch for herself and Masha and the mother-in-law. The allocation the letter describes, the recalculated allocation, the reduced allocation, the allocation that has just eliminated the supplementary portion that made the difference between adequate and not quite adequate, is the difference between 2 potatoes and 1. The letter, read carefully, means the difference between surviving this winter at the margin and not surviving it. Not in the abstract, not as a political calculation or an ideological dispute, or a number in an economist's projection. In the kitchen, at the level of the pot. Pyotr is at school. Masha is sitting on the floor of the 2nd room, wrapped in the quilt that Dmitry's mother brought from their old house in Pskov province before the collective farm absorbed it. The quilt is the warmest thing in the apartment. The apartment is cold because the heating allocation has also been recalculated sometime in November, and the pipes now produce warmth for approximately 4 hours per day in 2 sessions, neither of which coincides with the times when warmth is most needed. Dmitry is at the factory. The factory is producing tractors, which is what the current 5-year plan requires factories in this sector to produce, and Dmitry's skill as a machinist makes him a valued worker, which is why the household had the supplementary allocation until this morning. Now the supplementary allocation has been eliminated because a directive of the Central Committee, dated January 7, 1932, has recalculated the categories of employment that qualify for the supplement. The directive does not explain what changed on January 7th or why the category of factory machinist no longer qualifies. The directive simply is. It exists in the way that the cold exists, as a fact of the environment that does not require explanation or justification. She hears noise from the street and goes to the window. On the street below, Two NKVD officers in their distinctive dark coats are escorting a man from the building across the alley. The man is the husband from the Petrov family. Anya knows him by sight from the market, a stout man who works at the bread distribution depot. He is not wearing his coat, which means they came for him without warning, in a way that did not allow him to get his coat. His hands are in front of him, not behind. So he has not been handcuffed yet, or perhaps he has not been handcuffed because he is not resisting, because resisting would be worse than not resisting, because everyone in Leningrad in February 1932 understands the arithmetic of resistance. His wife is visible at the window of the apartment across the alley. She's holding the window frame with both hands. She's not calling out or reaching or making any visible attempt to intervene. She's holding the window frame and watching her husband walk across the snow with the two NKVD officers, and her face has the particular quality that Anya has seen on faces before in recent years. The quality of a person who is containing something too large to contain, who is performing stillness because stillness is what is required, and because the alternative to stillness is consequences. Anya does not know what Petrov did. She has heard the word in the building, sabotage, whispered by one of the other families, meaning something that the speaker could not or would not specify. Sabotage might mean he took bread from the depot. Sabotage might mean he said something to someone, or that someone said he said something, or that the depot's monthly figures were short by a quantity that could be attributed to negligence or misdirection. The word sabotage in the Soviet state of 1932 covers a range of meanings so wide that it can describe almost anything an official chooses to describe with it, which means that it describes nothing with any precision, which is precisely its function. Masha calls from the inner room, asking about lunch. Anya turns from the window. She looks at the pot with the water and the two potatoes. She looks at the letter on the table. She looks at the door of the inner room, behind which her daughter is waiting for an answer. She picks up the letter and puts it in the box where she keeps official documents, the ration cards, the residency registration, the papers that constitute, in the Soviet state of 1932, the official evidence that she and her family exist, that they are permitted to exist in this building, on this street, in this city, that they are the right kind of people, the approved kind, the kind that has not yet been recategorized into a different column of the official documents that determine whether you get the pot with two potatoes or the official attention of the men in the dark coats. She starts the potatoes. Outside, the NKVD officers and the stout man from the bread depot have turned the corner and are gone. The wife at the window is still holding the frame. In Moscow, in the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin is working at his desk in the small hours of the morning, as he does every night. He is reading reports from the regional committees about the grain collection quotas. He is marking passages in red pencil. He's writing notes in the margins. The numbers in the reports do not match the numbers that the plan requires, and the gap between the plan's requirements and the report's reality is a problem that requires a solution. And Stalin, reading the reports in the small hours of the Kremlin night with his red pencil, is formulating the solution. The solution will involve recalculating the allocations. It will involve new directives. It will arrive in Leningrad on a Tuesday in February as a formally written letter in bureaucratic Russian, informing Voronova, R.I., that her household's grain quota has been recalculated. And somewhere in a building in Moscow, Anya's name is in a file, just as Petrov's was, just as everyone's is. The red pencil moves. There is a specific quality to the fear in Soviet communal apartments in 1932 that distinguishes it from the fear that ordinary poverty produces, and the distinction is important. Poverty is frightening because it is uncertain, because the margin between survival and catastrophe shifts with illness and weather and chance, because the body is vulnerable to the material world in ways that no amount of will can fully overcome. That fear is universal and ancient. The fear in the communalka is something different. The fear in the communalka is administrative. It comes not from the uncertainty of the natural world, but from the certainty of the state. From knowing that the letter from the district committee is not bad luck or bad weather, but a decision made by people in offices about your specific household, and that decisions of this kind can be made without your input, without your knowledge, without any process you can participate in or appeal to. The material deprivation is real, but the material deprivation is the consequence of something that is in principle controllable, and therefore, in the specific logic of this system, your fault if it kills you. You fail to be sufficiently productive, sufficiently revolutionary, sufficiently compliant. The letter is the official notification that your failure has been noted. This particular quality of fear, the fear of a deliberate and legitimate authority that has decided to make your life worse, is qualitatively different from the fear of a natural disaster or an epidemic. A natural disaster has no interest in you specifically. An epidemic does not read your file before it infects you. But the Soviet state of 1932 has a file on you, and it reads it, and the decisions it makes are decisions about you in particular, based on a categorization of who you are, that you did not choose and cannot easily change. Dmitry Voronov's file categorizes him as a factory worker of the appropriate class background, which is why the household had the supplementary food allocation in the first place. But the category has been redefined, as categories in this system are regularly redefined, by a directive that he did not read, issued by a committee he does not know, because the directives that determine the conditions of his existence are not public documents. They are administrative instruments. They arrive as consequences, not as policies he could have engaged with or protested while they were still being formulated. The mother-in-law, sitting in the inner room with Masha under the quilt from Pskov, has lived through the revolution and the Civil War and the NEP period and the beginning of collectivization. And she has developed, from this experience, the specific wisdom of a person who has learned that the only reliable strategy for survival in a system of this kind is invisibility. Be ordinary. Attract no attention. Make no claims. Keep the letter from the district committee in the box with the other letters from the district committee and present it when required, and say nothing that is not required of you. This wisdom is not passive. It is, in fact, a form of active resistance. The resistance of the person who refuses to internalize the system's demand for enthusiastic participation, who maintains the private self intact behind the public performance of compliance, who hands Masha the bowl of potato water with the same steady hands as always, even though the hands know what the letter means and have decided, without visible deliberation, that the knowledge will not show on the face. The knowledge in the communalka is shared. Everyone in the building knows about the NKVD and Petrov across the alley because everyone in the building was at the window that morning. Everyone in the building knows about the recalculated grain quota because the recalculation applies to everyone. What no one in the building does in the months that follow is discuss these things with anyone outside the family unit. The knowledge is held in silence. The silence is shared by everyone, and the shared silence is both the product of fear and a form of protection. If no one says anything, no one has said anything that can be reported. The year 1932 is not yet the worst year. The worst year in Leningrad is coming, 10 years later, when the German army surrounds the city and the siege kills nearly 1 million people in 2 years of starvation. But the skills that Anya Voronova and the mother-in-law and the other families in the communalka are developing in February 1932 The skills of survival under conditions of administrative scarcity, the art of making 2 potatoes serve the purpose of 3, the particular alertness that a surveillance state produces in people who want to avoid its attention. These skills will matter. The bodies and the characters that the 1930s are building will be the bodies and characters that the 1940s require. Outside, the street is quiet. The man from the bread depot has gone around the corner with the NKVD officers. His wife has left the window. The building across the alley looks exactly as it always looks, its windows returning the flat grey light of a February morning in Leningrad, giving nothing away. Anya stirs the pot. To understand the Soviet Union that Joseph Stalin inherits and transforms, you have to understand the specific kind of state the Bolshevik Revolution actually produced, as opposed to the state it advertised itself as producing, because the gap between those 2 things is where Stalin builds his power. The Revolution of October 1917 is, in its immediate mechanics, a relatively small event. The seizure of key infrastructure, points in Petrograd by the Bolshevik Red Guard, organized by Trotsky, authorized by the Central Committee, with Lenin returning from exile in Finland to oversee the moment. The provisional government of Kerensky, exhausted by its own contradictions and unable to end the war or solve the food crisis or manage the centrifugal forces of a collapsed empire, offers essentially no resistance. The Winter Palace, the symbol of imperial power, falls without a serious battle. The revolution takes less than a night. What takes years is the consolidation of what the revolution has produced. The Bolsheviks govern a state that is at war from essentially the moment of their seizure of power. First, the ongoing World War, from which they extract Russia, at the price of the punishing Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, ceding enormous territory to Germany. Then the Civil War, from 1918 to 1921, a catastrophic conflict between the Red Army and the varied collection of anti-Bolshevik forces known as the Whites, with foreign intervention from Britain, France, Japan, and the United States supporting the Whites to varying degrees and with varying commitment. Then the famine of 1921 to 1922, which kills somewhere between 5 and 10 million people in the Volga region and Ukraine, and which is partly the consequence of the war and the disruption of agriculture, and partly the consequence of the Bolshevik grain requisitioning policies that the Civil War had normalized, and that habit and ideology were slow to abandon. The state that emerges from this sequence of catastrophes is shaped by them in specific ways that matter for what Stalin will later do with it. It is a state that has learned to govern through violence, through the Cheka, the security police founded by Felix Dzerzhinsky in December 1917, which operates from the first days of the revolution, with a mandate to suppress counter-revolution that is deliberately left undefined, so that the category of counter-revolution can expand to include whatever needs to be suppressed at any given moment. It is a state that has learned to manage a multi-ethnic, largely illiterate peasant population through a combination of terror and ideological mobilization. The techniques of the Civil War campaign applied at civilizational scale. And it is a state that has developed, through the years of emergency governance, a reflexive tendency to treat every problem as a military problem, to be solved through the application of organized force rather than through the negotiation and compromise that normal political life requires. The Communist Party that governs this state is, by the time of Lenin's incapacitation in 1922 and death in 1924, already marked by the internal tensions that will determine the succession struggle. It is a party of intellectuals, genuinely intellectuals, men and women who have read Marx and Engels and the whole tradition of European revolutionary thought with care and conviction, who debate the theoretical implications of policy decisions with a seriousness that is simultaneously their strength and their vulnerability. The theoretical arguments are real. The power politics beneath them are also real. And the men who are most skilled at the power politics are not always the ones who are most adept at the theoretical arguments. Lenin himself was exceptional at both. His successors are not. The new economic policy, the NEP, that Lenin introduces in 1921 as a tactical retreat from the full command economy of war communism, is the economic context within which Stalin consolidates his power. The NEP allows peasants to sell surplus grain on the open market rather than surrendering it all to the state, allows small private businesses to operate, permits a degree of market activity that the ideological purists within the party regard as ideological backsliding, but that Lenin defends as a necessary accommodation to reality. The NEP produces real economic recovery. It also produces the social classes that the more radical party members regard as ideologically threatening. The NEP men, the small merchants and traders who prosper under the partial market conditions, and the kulaks, the more prosperous peasants who accumulate modest land and equipment and are resented for it by their poorer neighbors, and by the party cadres who categorize rural prosperity as class betrayal. Remember the word kulak. You will need it. The Communist Party by the mid-1920s has somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million members, governing a country of roughly 140 million people through a structure of party cells, local Soviets, regional committees, and the central apparatus in Moscow. The party's relationship to the population it governs is not primarily consensual. The one-party state has no mechanism for genuine electoral accountability, and the security apparatus ensures that the cost of organized opposition is prohibitive. But it is also not simply coercive. There is genuine enthusiasm for the revolutionary project among a significant portion of the population, particularly among the young, the recently urbanized, the workers who have been told, and many of whom believe, that the revolution is building a world in which they will finally matter. The propaganda apparatus that the Bolshevik state builds from its earliest years is sophisticated and, by the standards of the 1920s, technologically innovative. Lenin understands cinema, describes it as the most important of all the arts for a largely illiterate population. And the state invests in film production with a seriousness that produces, in the work of Eisenstein and Vertov and Pudovkin, some of the greatest cinema of the 20th century. The literacy campaigns of the 1920s are genuine and genuinely successful. The proportion of the Soviet population that can read increases substantially across the decade, creating a newly literate public that can be reached through print as well as through image and sound. The newspapers, the posters, the radio broadcasts. All of it is organized around the project of constructing a Soviet citizen who understands and embraces the party's version of history and the party's vision of the future. The geography of this empire matters enormously for what Stalin will do with it. The Soviet Union spans 11 time zones, from the Baltic to the Pacific, from the Arctic coast to the borders of Persia and China. It contains a bewildering diversity of ethnicities, languages, religions, and economic conditions. The industrializing cities of the Urals and the Donbass, the vast agricultural regions of Ukraine and Kazakhstan, the nomadic herding cultures of Central Asia, the forest peoples of Siberia, the Caucasian nationalities, Georgian, Armenian, Azeri, with their own ancient histories and their own complex relationships to Russian imperial power, both before and after 1917. Governing this empire requires either genuine federalism, real power shared with the constituent nationalities, or a centralism so aggressive and so effectively enforced that the diversity cannot organize itself into resistance. The Soviet state under Lenin attempts a hybrid, a formal federalism in the constitutional structure combined with the reality of party control at every level. Stalin will convert the hybrid into something else entirely. The key structural feature of the Soviet state that makes Stalinist terror possible is the concentration of the coercive apparatus in the hands of the Central Party leadership, entirely without the constraints that limit state violence in systems with independent judiciaries, free press, or genuine political opposition. The Cheka becomes the GPU, becomes the OGPU, becomes the NKVD. The organizational names change, the initials change, the heads change, but the function does not change. It is the instrument through which the party enforces its will against the population. It governs without oversight, without appeal, without the procedural constraints that make coercive authority predictable and therefore governable by those subject to it. The courts exist, but they are party instruments. The law exists, but it is defined to serve party purposes. Article 58 of the Soviet Criminal Code, the article under which most political repression is conducted, defines counter-revolutionary activity in terms so broad that any action, or any statement, or any absence of action, or any silence can be prosecuted under it if the political circumstances require prosecution. Article 58 is a legal form that functions as a blank check drawn on the population's freedom, payable on demand to whichever NKVD officer or party official needs an arrest. The press exists, but it prints what it is told to print. The scientists exist, but the science it is permitted to practice must not contradict ideological positions. The intellectuals exist, but the ideas they may entertain must not threaten the party's monopoly on the correct interpretation of Marxist-Leninist thought, which is itself a monopoly held by whoever currently controls the party's theoretical apparatus, which is ultimately whoever controls the party. By 1928, the man who controls the party is Joseph Stalin. He controls it not through charisma. He lacks Lenin's intellectual force and Trotsky's rhetorical brilliance. He controls it through the specific kind of organizational skill that the party's administrative structure rewards. The management of appointments, the cultivation of loyalty networks, the patient accumulation of information about rivals that can be deployed at the right moment to eliminate them. He controls it because he understood, earlier than his rivals, that the party's bureaucratic apparatus was the real locus of power in the Soviet state, and that controlling the apparatus meant controlling the state, regardless of who could write the most persuasive theoretical tract or give the most brilliant speech. He controls it, and now he has an agenda. The agenda is, on its face, the agenda of the Soviet state. Industrialization, collectivization, the transformation of the Soviet Union from an agrarian society into an industrial power capable of matching the capitalist countries that Stalin believes are preparing to invade and destroy it. These are real policy goals, and the fear of encirclement, the belief that the capitalist world is permanently hostile to the Soviet state, and that only rapid industrialization can produce the military capacity to survive, is a real belief that many Bolsheviks share and that has some foundation in the actual history of foreign intervention during the Civil War. What transforms these policy goals into the particular catastrophe of the 1930s is the specific method Stalin chooses to implement them. Not persuasion, not economic incentive, not the kind of patient institution building that produces sustainable change, but force. overwhelming, comprehensive, administered force applied to a population of 140 million people through a bureaucratic machinery that has been systematically stripped of every constraint that might slow it down or redirect it. The first target is the peasantry, and the weapon is collectivization. The specific structure of the Soviet state in the late 1920s, the structure that Stalin inherits and begins to transform, is worth examining in its bureaucratic detail, because the detail is where the terror lives. Large-scale atrocity does not happen in the abstract. It happens in the specific forms that specific institutional arrangements make possible, and the Soviet state has by 1928 developed a set of institutional arrangements that are, from the perspective of anyone who wants to use them for mass coercion, exceptionally well designed. The party's relationship to the state apparatus is the fundamental structural feature. The Soviet Union has the formal institutions of a modern state: ministries, courts, legislatures, a military. But these institutions are staffed by party members and supervised by party organs, so that the formal institutional hierarchy and the party hierarchy are parallel structures with the party always dominant. The consequence is that the normal checks that institutional plurality provides, the judiciary's independence from the executive, the legislature's ability to constrain the administration, the press's freedom to criticize government action, do not exist in the Soviet case, because all of these institutions are ultimately controlled by the same party organization. The OGPU, which becomes the NKVD in 1934, which becomes the MGB and MVD after the war, the initials changing but the function constant, is the instrument that makes this system operational at the ground level. The security apparatus is not a separate institution that operates outside the normal structures of Soviet governance. It is integrated into those structures with party liaison officers at every level of government, with informant networks embedded in every factory and collective farm and apartment block and military unit and university department. The NKVD officer is not an exceptional figure who appears only in moments of crisis. He is a permanent feature of the Soviet institutional landscape, present everywhere, visible or invisible as circumstances require. The relationship between the NKVD and the party leadership is one of the central dynamics of Stalinist governance, and it shifts over time in ways that tell you something important about how the system manages its own internal tensions. In the early years of the Stalin period, the NKVD is a powerful but still nominally subordinate instrument. Yagoda, its head from 1934, is a senior figure but not a member of Stalin's inner circle, and the security apparatus operates under constraints that are real if not legally formalized. Then Yagoda is replaced by Yezhov in 1936, and the constraints dissolve. Yezhov is a small man, 5 feet tall, whom Stalin calls the Iron Commissar, and who is known in the Soviet security apparatus as Yezhov the Dwarf, and whose name attaches to the most intense period of the terror in what historians call the Yezhov China, the Yezhov years. He is a man of genuine ideological conviction who has convinced himself that the enemies of the revolution are everywhere and that finding them requires the willingness to destroy people on the basis of suspicion, accusation, and statistical probability rather than on the basis of evidence. He receives the quotas from Stalin, and he does not simply meet them. He asks for more. In August 1937, Order 00447, the operational order that launches the mass operations of the terror, is issued from Moscow to every regional NKVD department. The order sets targets: a first category of people to be shot, a second category to be sent to the camps. Specific numbers assigned to each region based on the regional NKVD's estimates of the enemy population in its territory. The categories include former kulaks who have returned from the camps, former political prisoners, criminals, members of anti-Soviet parties, religious figures, and an omnibus category of anti-Soviet elements that can accommodate essentially anyone the regional NKVD chooses to include. The regional NKVD chiefs, in most cases, immediately request increases to their quotas. The requests are approved. The shooting begins. What is happening across 11 time zones in the summer and autumn and winter of 1937 is the state operating not as a system for governing a population, but as a system for consuming one. The agricultural collectivization and the industrial 5-year plans are not separate from the terror. They are the same project, approached from different angles. The collectivization produces the grain that the state needs for export. The terror eliminates the people who might resist the collectivization, or who might question the 5-year plan's targets, or who might communicate the reality of the famine to the outside world. The show trials eliminate the political rivals who might challenge the leadership. The purge of the military eliminates the generals who might have the institutional independence to resist political control. The system is self-reinforcing in the specific way that bureaucratic systems always are when their incentive structures reward a particular output. When the NKVD is rewarded for producing enemies, it produces enemies. When local officials are rewarded for meeting grain quotas, they meet grain quotas regardless of the human cost. When regional party secretaries are judged by the number of saboteurs they expose saboteurs. The system does not need Stalin to personally direct each of these outcomes. It produces them automatically, from the combination of the incentives and the personnel, and the absence of any institutional break. The industrialization that is the regime's primary stated goal during this period is real. The Soviet Union in 1940 is genuinely more industrialized than the Soviet Union in 1929, has more steel production, more tractor production, more electrical generation, more railroad capacity, more heavy industrial output of virtually every kind. The 5-year plans achieve their industrial targets, or something close to them, in the sectors that the regime considers primary. The human cost of this achievement, the gulag labor that builds the canals and the roads and the factories, the collectivization famine that kills 4 to 7 million people in Ukraine alone, the terror that eliminates the engineers and scientists and administrators who might have built the industrialization more efficiently and with fewer deaths, is not subtracted from the achievement in the official accounting. It should be. Iosif Yugashvili is born on December 18, 1878, in the Georgian town of Gori. And the first thing you need to know about Gori is that it is not Moscow. This matters. The man who will govern the Soviet Union from Moscow for 30 years, who will make himself the center of the Russian imperial project in its Soviet form, who will be depicted on posters and in paintings as the father of the Russian nation. This man is not Russian. He is Georgian. He grows up speaking Georgian before he learns Russian with an accent that he never fully loses, and that his political rivals will mock in private and that he will be sensitive about for the rest of his life. He is, in the empire he governs, a member of a conquered minority. The psychological implications of this, the combination of resentment and ambition that characterizes the person who arrives as an outsider and determines to surpass the insiders on their own terms, run through everything he does. Gori, in the late 19th century, is a provincial Georgian town in a province of the Russian Empire. And the Russia of the 1880s and 1890s is an empire undergoing the specific kind of violent transformation that rapid industrialization produces in a society that has not developed the political institutions capable of managing it. The abolition of serfdom in 1861 has freed the peasants without providing them with enough land to survive on, producing a vast mobile population of rural poor who move between the countryside and the industrializing cities in search of employment that is precarious, dangerous, and badly paid. The imperial government of the Romanovs maintains its authority through a combination of bureaucratic repression, religious orthodoxy, and the specific weight of the Russian Orthodox Church as an instrument of social control. The intelligentsia that emerges from the universities is infected with the revolutionary theories that are circulating across Europe. The government's response to this intelligentsia is a cycle of repression and radicalization that steadily increases the temperature of the revolutionary movement. The family that produces Ioseb Yugashvili is working-class Georgian at its most marginal. His father, Beso, is a cobbler, a skilled craftsman, which in the economy of Gori in 1880 means a man who is not destitute, but who is nowhere near secure, who drinks too much, who is prone to the violence that economic precarity and masculine pride and alcohol produce in combination. Beso is physically violent with his wife Kike, and physically violent with Ioseb when the boy is in the wrong place at the wrong time, which is often enough that the pattern is documented by neighbors and by the memoirs of people who knew the family. The violence matters, not because every victim of childhood violence becomes a perpetrator of adult violence. The causal chain is not that simple, and the research on intergenerational violence is more nuanced than the popular account suggests. But because the specific combination of things that the Gori childhood produces in Ioseb Yugashvili, the vigilance of the child who has learned to read the emotional state of the unpredictable adult in the room, the capacity for patience and calculation that comes from navigating a household where the rules change without warning, the specific coldness that the habitual suppression of fear produces in a person who has been frightened often enough and young enough. These qualities are visible in the adult political figure, and they are not coincidental. He is also genuinely intelligent. This is not incidental and should not be dismissed. The narrative of Stalin as primarily a brutal mediocrity who arrived at power through organizational cunning rather than intellectual force is, at best, incomplete. He reads widely and retains what he reads. His annotations in the books of his personal library, which survive in the archives, are not the marginal notes of a man going through the motions of intellectual engagement. They are the notes of a person who is genuinely thinking, who is arguing with the text, who is making connections and testing ideas. He understands Marxist theory with a depth that most of his political opponents underestimate, partly because his manner of communicating it is less flamboyant than Trotsky's, and partly because intelligence in service of political manipulation is easy to mistake for mere cunning. His mother, Keke, is the stabilizing force in the Gori childhood, devout, determined, managing Beso's volatility and the family's poverty with a practical intelligence that her son inherits and transforms into something less domestic but equally relentless. She secures Ioseb a place at the Gori Church School, and then at the Tiflis Spiritual Seminary, because the seminary offers a path out of the specific trap that a cobbler's son in Gori is otherwise born into, a path toward education, toward the social advancement that the church offers to talented boys from poor families, toward the world of books and ideas that Ioseb is already consuming with the appetite of someone who has understood that what is between those covers is also a form of power. The Tiflis Spiritual Seminary is, in the late 1890s, a hotbed of exactly the kind of Georgian nationalist and Russian revolutionary thinking that it is officially designed to suppress. The students read forbidden books, they pass prohibited pamphlets from hand to hand. They organize discussion circles that slide from theological debate into political theory, with a casualness that suggests the seminary authorities have less control over their students' intellectual lives than they believe. Ioseb reads Marxist literature. The Georgia of the 1890s has an active social democratic movement that is distributing this material specifically to seminary students and factory workers, understanding that both populations have reasons to be receptive to it. He organizes. He argues. He begins to develop the combination of theoretical conviction and organizational skill that will define his political persona for the next 4 decades. He is expelled from the seminary in 1899, officially for missing examinations, probably for political activity that the seminary authorities can document without the formal charge of revolutionary organizing. He has spent 5 years absorbing not only Marxist political theory, but also, and this is the piece that his biographers sometimes underemphasize, the specific methods of an institution organized around absolute doctrinal authority, internal surveillance, hierarchical obedience, and the punishment of deviation. The seminary prepares Ioseb Yughashvili for the party structure he will later inhabit and eventually dominate. The methodology of ideological control that he learns at the feet of Georgian Orthodox seminarians will be applied, with modifications, to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He takes the name Koba first, a Georgian folk hero, an outlaw avenger, and then later Stalin, Steel. The transformation of name is the most visible sign of the transformation of self that the revolutionary movement demands, and that Yughashvili embraces more completely than most. The discarding of the provincial Georgian identity and the assumption of the new Soviet revolutionary identity, which in Stalin's case goes further than in most others, because the new identity offers compensation for all the specific inadequacies of the old one. The years between the seminary expulsion in 1899 and the revolution in 1917 are the years of the professional revolutionary, the specific kind of life that the Bolshevik movement produces, organized around underground organizing, printing and distribution of prohibited literature, the cultivation of networks, periodic arrest, imprisonment, Siberian exile, escape, return, repeat. Stalin is arrested 7 times between 1902 and 1913. He escapes from Siberian exile at least twice. He survives the specific attrition of the revolutionary underground, the arrests, the informers, the executions, the deportations, with a hardiness that others attribute to luck, and that he attributes to caution and to the specific quality of judgment that allows you to identify the informer before the informer identifies you. He is also, during this period, the organizer of bank robberies, expropriations, in the ideological vocabulary of the movement, a term that captures the function while laundering the method. The most spectacular of these is the Tiflis bank robbery of 1907, in which a Bolshevik squad throws bombs at a convoy carrying government funds through the central square of Tiflis, killing approximately 50 people and stealing a very large sum that goes to fund party operations. Stalin organizes this operation from a distance. The men with the bombs are others. The man with the organizational plan is Stalin. This pattern, organizing violence from a safe distance through intermediaries, while maintaining plausible deniability about the specific operational details, is the pattern of the Tiflis robbery, and it is the pattern of the Great Purge 30 years later. The organizational method remains constant. The scale changes beyond anything the young revolutionary in Tiflis could have imagined. After 1917, the revolution provides the structure that his personality requires, an organization of absolute loyalty, doctrinal certainty, and hierarchical authority in which his specific skills administrative patience, organizational memory, the cultivation and deployment of human networks are more valuable than the rhetorical brilliance and theoretical fluency that make Trotsky and Zinoviev and Bukharin more visible and less powerful. He becomes the General Secretary of the Central Committee in 1922, the same year that Lenin's health begins to collapse. The General Secretary position is administrative. It controls party appointments, manages the party bureaucracy, oversees the flow of paperwork through the organization. The intellectuals of the Bolshevik Party regard this position as somewhat beneath their theoretical dignity. Trotsky, who could have taken the position and understood its significance, regards administrative work as incompatible with the role of revolutionary leader. He does not want to be a bureaucrat. This is the mistake that costs him everything. Lenin recognizes the mistake too late. In the document historians call Lenin's Testament, dictated in December 1922 and January 1923 as his health deteriorates, Lenin warns the party that Stalin has accumulated too much power as General Secretary, that he is too rude, too capricious, and suggests that the party consider removing him from the position. Lenin's assessment of the other candidates is not flattering either, but the passage on Stalin is specific in its concern. The warning is recorded. It is read to the party Congress after Lenin's death. The Congress decides not to act on it, partly because Stalin has already distributed enough appointments and cultivated enough loyalties that the people who would need to remove him are the people who owe him their positions. Lenin is dead in January 1924. Within 4 years, every major competitor for succession is politically destroyed. Zinoviev and Kamenev, Stalin's allies against Trotsky in 1924 to 1925, discarded as soon as Trotsky is neutralized. Trotsky, expelled from the party in 1927, exiled in 1929, eventually assassinated in Mexico City in 1940 by an NKVD agent with an ice axe. Bukharin, the theorist of the NEP's continuation, the man Lenin called the party's most valuable theorist, broken in the show trials of 1938 and shot. Each elimination follows the same pattern, a political alliance that serves Stalin's immediate interests, followed by a reversal when the ally becomes a rival or a threat, followed by a campaign of denunciation and organizational pressure that destroys the target's political base before the final, formal elimination. The pattern is not improvised. It is applied with the consistency of a man who has worked out the method and trusts it. By 1928, when Stalin launches collectivization, the last constraints on his authority within the party have been removed. He is not yet the total autocrat he will become by 1934 or 1937. There are still Politburo members who can voice disagreement. There are still processes of collective deliberation that retain some substance. But the direction is clear, and the direction is toward the concentration of all power, all decision, all authority in one person. In the man with the red pencil. In the man in the Kremlin reading the grain quota reports at 3 a.m. The central psychological question about Stalin is the one historians have argued about since at least the 1950s. Was he primarily an ideological true believer who used terror in service of a genuine Marxist-Leninist vision, or was he primarily a paranoid megalomaniac who used ideology as cover for the pursuit of personal power? The honest answer is that the distinction is not as clean as either formulation suggests. He believes, genuinely believes, in a version of Marxism-Leninism that has been shaped by decades of reading and practice, and that is not simply a cynical mask over the power drive. He also has a paranoia, a genuine, pathological suspicion of rivals and potential rivals that escalates across the 1930s until it becomes untethered from any realistic assessment of actual threats. Both things are simultaneously true. The ideological conviction and the personal pathology reinforce each other because the ideology provides the framework within which the paranoia can justify itself. Enemies of the revolution are real. The Soviet state is genuinely surrounded by hostile powers. The revolutionary project genuinely has opponents within the country. The class struggle genuinely produces people who resist collectivization and industrialization and the party's authority. The paranoia takes this real framework and expands it without limit, finding enemies in every deviation, every hesitation, every conversation with a foreigner or expression of doubt about a policy or failure to meet a quota. The paranoia is fed by the ideology, and the ideology is weaponized by the paranoia. And the result is a political system in which the production of enemies is not an accident, but a structural necessity. The system needs enemies to function. Terror requires targets. The NKVD requires quotas. The show trials require confessions. The confessions require interrogation. The interrogation requires suspects. The suspects require accusations. The accusations require accusers. The accusers are ordinary people who have been placed in a system that rewards denunciation and punishes silence, and who make the rational calculation that in a world where someone will be accused, it is better to be the accuser than to wait and be accused. Stalin builds this system deliberately. He understands it. He designed it. He maintains it through the specific quality of attention, the reading of the reports, the marking of the margins, the signing of the execution lists. That is the most disturbing thing in his biography, because it reveals a man who is not operating at a remove from the consequences of his decisions, but who is, in the most literal sense, personally present in the machinery of mass death. He signs death lists. He goes through them with his red pencil. He signs his name. He notes exceptions. He asks questions. He's not a man who looks away from what he is doing. He looks directly at it. And he continues. The question of how a person becomes capable of the specific kind of violence that Stalin organizes, the systematic, bureaucratic, deliberately designed mass killing of his own population, is the question that his biography must answer, and that the available biographical material answers only partially and in ways that are always disputable. The partial answer available in the psychology of the revolutionary underground is this. The years between 1899 and 1917, the years of arrest and exile and underground organizing, produce a specific kind of person who has undergone a process that is in some ways analogous to the dehumanization training that military organizations apply to soldiers, but that operates through ideology rather than through explicit conditioning. The revolutionary who has been arrested, imprisoned, and exiled multiple times has learned in the most visceral way possible that the state regards him as an enemy to be contained. He has spent years in cells and in Siberian exile with other people the state regards as enemies. He has organized his understanding of the world entirely around the distinction between the revolutionary movement and its enemies, a distinction that assigns moral weight exclusively to the first category and denies it to the second. This binary moral framework, the most fundamental of the binary moral frameworks that extreme ideological commitment produces, is the psychological precondition for the specific form of violence that Stalin organizes. You cannot send 100,000 people to their deaths for missing a grain quota if you regard them as ordinary human beings with their own claims on life and dignity and the future. You can do it if you regard them as class enemies, as saboteurs, as wreckers of the socialist construction, as people who, in the framework of the ideology, have forfeited their claim on the revolutionary community's protection by aligning themselves, through their resistance or their inadequacy or their insufficient revolutionary zeal, with the enemies of the project. Stalin's biography does not contain a moment of moral rupture, a before and after, a crossing of a line that he knew was a line. It contains a gradual escalation from the lower levels of violence that the revolutionary underground normalized, the bank robbery, the organizing of beatings of informers, to the higher levels that the possession of state power makes possible, with each escalation building on the precedent of the previous one, and therefore not requiring the kind of moral accounting that a fresh decision would require. He becomes capable of the Great Terror not in one terrible moment, but over a decade of smaller decisions, each of which is prepared for by the decisions that preceded it. The specific texture of his relationship with the people around him in his peak power years is documented through multiple memoirs. Those of Khrushchev, of Mikoyan, of others who survived the inner circle and wrote about it afterward. And the picture they produce is not the picture of a man who is isolated from human contact or who has ceased to function in ordinary social relationships. He jokes sometimes. He watches films in his private screening room, often multiple times the same film. He hosts late-night dinners at the dacha that last until 2 or 3 in the morning, where the required attendance of the Politburo members and their wives is understood to be compulsory, and where the drinking is also understood to be compulsory, and where Stalin sometimes presides over the collective humiliation of his guests in ways that are experienced as casual social occasions by the man conducting them and as ordeals by the people on the receiving end. The dinners are a form of dominance display. They are also, genuinely, a form of social life. The particular social life available to a man of absolute power, which is a social life in which every interaction is mediated by the power differential, and in which the only genuine uncertainty in the room concerns what he himself will do next. He is not, in these moments, performatively monstrous. He is in the specific way that the memoirists describe, with a consistency that suggests they are capturing something real, present, curious, attentive, capable of genuine warmth toward children, capable of appreciating a good film or a well-turned argument. This is not a paradox. It is the ordinary human capacity for moral compartmentalization pushed to its extreme. The man who signs the execution lists and the man who enjoys a good Georgian wine at a late-night dinner are not in conflict in Stalin's psychology. They are in the same room. The person in front of him at the dinner table is a person. The name on the execution list is a category. Khrushchev writes in his memoirs about the experience of sitting next to Stalin at one of these dinners and not knowing, from one moment to the next, whether the conversation would end with a warm farewell or with an instruction to the NKVD duty officer waiting in the anteroom. This uncertainty, the impossibility of reading the situation, the way that warmth and menace could coexist in the same evening without apparent inconsistency, is described by multiple survivors of the inner circle as one of the most psychologically destructive features of proximity to Stalin. You could never calibrate, you could never prepare, you could never relax. This was not accidental. Stalin understood that the inability of his subordinates to read him was itself a source of power, that people who cannot predict the consequences of their actions will default to maximum compliance as the safest strategy, will report everything, will never withhold information that might be relevant, will work to exhaustion to meet the targets, because the alternative to maximum compliance is uncertainty about consequences that could be catastrophic. He manages his relationships with his senior subordinates with a consistency that is visible across decades, He never allows any single person to accumulate too much power, too much popular support, too much institutional authority, never allows the impression to form that anyone in the system is indispensable. Kirov, who might have been developing into a figure of that kind, is dead by December 1934. Zhukov, who becomes a genuine popular hero through the Second World War, is demoted and exiled to a regional command immediately after the war's end. The pattern is consistent enough to constitute a policy. The one significant exception to this pattern, the one person whom Stalin seems genuinely to have valued, and who maintained a privileged position through most of the terror years, is Lavrenti Beria, who takes over the NKVD from Yezhov in late 1938, at the point when the Great Terror has produced enough chaos in the security apparatus itself that even Stalin recognizes the need for a more controlled approach. Beria is, by any standard, a vicious and personally sadistic man whose use of sexual violence as an instrument of power is documented across decades and whose moral record makes Yezhov look like a minor offender. But he is also capable in the specific way that Stalin values capability. He can manage the security apparatus efficiently. He can organize large-scale operations. He can keep secrets, and he understands that his own survival depends entirely on Stalin's continued favor. Stalin trusts Beria with the one thing he trusts anyone with: operational execution. The decisions are Stalin's. The execution is Beria's. The relationship is the relationship of the architect and the contractor, and the building they are constructing together is the architecture of terror. The collectivization of Soviet agriculture begins in earnest in 1929 and is, in its basic mechanics, the most dramatic forced transformation of a society since the enclosures of early modern England, except that it affects not a few 100,000 displaced peasants, but the 100 million strong agricultural population of the largest country on earth, and it is conducted not over generations, but over 2 years, with a speed and a violence that the agricultural system cannot absorb. The theory behind collectivization is clear in its own terms. Individual peasant farming is inefficient, ideologically suspect, and incompatible with the socialist construction that the party is pursuing. Small landholders are petty bourgeois in their social psychology, inclined to think in terms of their own plots and their own households, rather than in terms of the collective good. The solution is the collective farm, the kolkhoz, in which the land, the equipment, and the labor are socialized and managed according to the plan. The collective farm will produce more food, more efficiently, releasing surplus grain for export, funding the industrialization drive, and creating the agricultural proletariat that Marxist theory requires. The theory fails to engage with several things that matter. It fails to engage with the fact that the peasants who have spent their entire lives farming specific parcels of land have knowledge of that land, its drainage, its soil composition, its microclimate, that cannot be transferred to a collective administration. It fails to engage with the incentive problem. If the grain you grow belongs to the collective rather than to you, the rational response is to grow as little as possible and consume or conceal as much of what you grow before the collective can take it. It fails to engage with the violence that will be required to impose on 100 million people a change in their economic life that they did not choose and do not want. Stalin is aware of the incentive problem, the knowledge problem, and the resistance problem. He solves them all with the same instrument: overwhelming coercive force applied without procedural constraint. The specific human instrument of this force is the 25,000ers, the 25,000 urban workers who are recruited from factories in the cities and sent to the countryside as collectivization enforcers in 1930. They are mostly young, mostly male, mostly from the industrial working class, mostly literate, mostly convinced that they are performing a revolutionary duty. They are sent into villages with authority to organize collective farms, to confiscate land and equipment, to identify kulaks for deportation, and to ensure that the grain quota is met regardless of what meeting it does to the actual food supply of the village. The category of kulak, the prosperous peasant, the class enemy in the village, is in practice applied with a flexibility that strips it of any stable meaning. The official definition distinguishes between first-category kulaks, organizers of anti-Soviet activity, second-category kulaks, less active class enemies, and third-category kulaks, to be resettled within the region. In practice, the category is applied by local officials and 25,000ers whose knowledge of the village may be minimal, whose definition of kulak may amount to nothing more than a neighbor who had a cow when the others did not, whose motivation to identify class enemies may include the personal benefit of avoiding being classified as insufficiently revolutionary themselves. The deportations that follow are massive and catastrophic. The official statistics, which are incomplete and sanitized, but which represent the minimum of what actually happened, record the deportation of approximately 1.8 million people designated as kulaks between 1930 and 1931. They are transported in cattle cars to Siberia, to Kazakhstan, to the far north, to the special settlements, posyolki, that are hastily constructed in regions whose climate and terrain make ordinary human survival marginal. The special settlements have no prepared infrastructure. The deportees arrive in winter or in spring, or in whatever season the transport schedule happens to deliver them, with whatever they were able to carry when the NKVD came for them, and they are released into the settlements and expected to survive. Many do not survive. The mortality in the special settlements in the early 1930s is exceptionally high. Estimates run from a few percent to a quarter of the deportee population in the first years, with the highest mortality among children and the elderly who cannot endure the combination of cold, inadequate shelter, inadequate food, and the shock of displacement from the only life they had known. The families are separated in the process. Men sent to labor camps, women and children to special settlements. The structure of the family that had organized rural life destroyed by the administrative process of deportation. The famine that follows the collectivization campaign in 1932 and 1933 is the most catastrophic consequence of the policy. In the Ukrainian case, the Holodomor is the most documented and the most devastating regional instance of a disaster that affects multiple Soviet regions. Ukraine in 1932 is the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, the most agriculturally productive region of the country, the source of a substantial proportion of the grain that the export program depends on. The collectivization campaign in Ukraine encounters fierce resistance from peasants who slaughter their animals rather than surrender them to the collective, who conceal grain in pits and under floorboards and in hidden caches, who organize passive resistance and occasional active resistance that the NKVD suppresses with the force that all resistance to collectivization receives. The state's response to the resistance is to increase the quota. When the villagers cannot meet the increased quota, the NKVD searches the households for concealed grain. When the household search turns up hidden food, the food is confiscated as evidence of hoarding. When entire districts cannot meet the quota despite the searches, the district is placed on the blacklist, the blackboard list, the official register of villages that are denied access to basic goods, including salt and matches, until the quota is met. The blacklist, introduced in November 1932, functions as a collective punishment of a village for its failure to produce grain that in many cases literally no longer exists in the village's territory because the previous requisitioning has left nothing. Villages on the blacklist cannot obtain food from outside the village. They cannot receive bread rations. They cannot purchase food from any state distribution point. The internal passport system, introduced in December 1932, prevents the peasants from leaving, from traveling to the cities where food might be available, or to regions where the famine is less severe. They are sealed in the dying villages. The death toll of the Ukrainian famine of 1932 to 1933 is estimated by historians at between 3.5 million and 7 million people, with most serious estimates clustering in the range of 4 to 5 million. The range reflects the genuine difficulty of counting deaths in a context where record-keeping was disrupted and the Soviet state actively suppressed information about the famine. Denied the famine's existence, in fact, both internally and internationally, to a degree that required the active falsification of the 1937 census results, which showed a population smaller than the party's projections indicated, and whose authors were subsequently arrested and shot for producing figures that contradicted the official narrative of Soviet progress. The specific human reality of the famine has been documented through the oral histories collected by researchers after the Soviet period ended, and through the testimonies of survivors and foreign observers who were in Ukraine during the famine years. The Ukrainian historian Andrea Graziosi has described these accounts, villages in which the food is so completely exhausted that families eat grass, tree bark, clay, anything that might contain calories. Villages in which the NKVD teams still come to search for hidden grain in houses where the inhabitants are dying of starvation. Villages in which the bodies of the dead lie in the street because no one who is still living has the strength to bury them. Villages in which the horror of the famine produces the absolute worst of what starvation produces in human communities. The cannibalism that the Soviet authorities record in their own internal documents, noting cases in which the dead are eaten and eventually in which the living are killed to be eaten. These are not anecdotes of the extreme edge. They are documented patterns in multiple regions, recorded in the NKVD's own reports to Moscow, reports that therefore exist in the archives and that establish, with the cold precision of a bureaucratic document, that the authorities in Moscow knew exactly what was happening in the villages and continued the policy. The policy continues because the alternative, acknowledging the famine, reducing the quotas, allowing the peasants to keep enough food to survive, would require acknowledging that the policy had failed. And acknowledging that the policy had failed would raise the question of who had designed the policy. That question has only one answer, and that answer, in the Soviet Union of 1932 and 1933, is not one that can be acknowledged. The Great Terror of 1936 to 1938 is the phase of Stalinist violence that is most completely documented, partly because it affects the party and the state elite rather than primarily the peasantry, and partly because its mechanics, the show trials, the confessions, the execution lists, produce paper in quantities that even the Soviet state's post-facto efforts at destruction cannot fully eliminate. The trigger for the mass terror phase is the assassination of Sergei Kirov, the Leningrad party boss, on December 1st, 1934. Kirov is shot in the Smolny Institute by a young party member named Leonid Nikolaev. The exact circumstances of Kirov's murder have been a subject of historical debate since at least Khrushchev's time, with a substantial body of circumstantial evidence suggesting that Stalin authorized, or at least facilitated the assassination, or at minimum allowed the security failure that made it possible, because Kirov had been developing a political profile that made him a potential rival. The historical debate about this has not been definitively resolved by the available evidence. What is not disputed is that Stalin uses Kirov's murder as the pretext for a wave of political arrests that reaches, within 4 years, into every corner of the Soviet state. The machinery of the Great Terror operates through a specific, designed sequence. At the top, Stalin and the Politburo set the policy. The class enemies, the foreign spies, the saboteurs, the Trotskyite, Zinovievite, Bukharinist wreckers must be rooted out and destroyed. In the middle, the NKVD under Nikolai Yezhov, the Yezhovshchina, the Yezhovian period named for the head who accelerates the terror to its most intense phase, translates the policy into operational directives. Quotas for arrests, quotas for executions, quotas for labor camp sentences, assigned to each region of the country as a plan to be fulfilled. The quotas are the key operational element of the Great Terror, and they are the element that makes it impossible to understand as anything other than a designed system rather than a response to genuine security threats. Regional NKVD chiefs receive targets. Arrest this many people in this category, execute this many, send this many to the camps. When the regional chief meets the quota, he can request more. Some regional chiefs do request more, either out of ideological zeal or out of the calculation that demonstrating excess revolutionary vigilance is safer than failing to meet the target. The requests are generally approved, the overall numbers rise. The experience of arrest under this system is documented in detail by the people who survived it and who wrote about it afterward, primarily in the memoirs and letters that circulated in Samizdat during the Soviet period, and that became available to Western readers through the work of scholars like Robert Conquest, and through the explosion of archival access in the late Soviet and post-Soviet periods. The arrest itself is almost always at night. The knock on the door, the flash of the badge, the brief and perfunctory explanation. Article 58. Counter-revolutionary activity, sometimes not even that. And then the search of the apartment that takes hours, that leaves the apartment in disorder, that takes papers and books and sometimes objects whose relevance to any conceivable legal proceeding is impossible to imagine. And then the departure of the arrested person and the agents and the door closing, and the family left behind in the disordered apartment in the silence of the early morning. The interrogation that follows the arrest is designed to produce a confession. The confession is required not because the legal system needs evidence, the outcome of the proceeding is determined before it begins, but because the system needs the defendant's participation in his own destruction, needs the specific theatrical gesture of the guilty plea that allows the show trial to function as a morality play about the enemies of the revolution and the vigilance of the party. The methods used to extract these confessions are documented with a specificity that the records in the Russian archives make it impossible to deny. Sleep deprivation, sustained over weeks, the conveyor belt interrogation, in which teams of interrogators replace each other so that the subject never sleeps while the interrogators do. Physical beatings, threats against family members, the production of false evidence implicating associates who have already confessed and named the subject as a co-conspirator, and the specific psychological technique of sustained pressure from multiple interrogators who repeat the accusation in slightly different forms until the subject loses the ability to maintain the internal distinction between what actually happened and what is being asserted. The most senior defendants in the show trials, the old Bolsheviks, the men who had made the revolution and who are now being destroyed by it, confess to crimes that are, in many cases, literally impossible, to conspiracies that require being in 3 places simultaneously, to meetings with foreign agents that other evidence places them thousands of miles from. They confess because they have been broken or because they have made a calculation that their families will be safer if they cooperate, or because they have internalized the party's logic sufficiently to believe, on some level, that if the party says they are guilty of something, the party must be right. Bukharin is the most analytically interesting of these cases. He negotiates his confession with Stalin directly, in a series of letters that survive in the archive, and the negotiation reveals a man who understands perfectly well what is happening to him, who recognizes the show trial for what it is, and who nevertheless participates in it, who writes the confession, who performs it in court, who maintains to the last moment the fiction that the party's verdict is legitimate, because he has no other framework within which to process his situation. The party is the only thing he has ever believed in. He cannot stop believing in it even as it destroys him. He is shot on March 15th, 1938. The specific mechanics of the Gulag system deserve more examination than they usually receive, because the Gulag is not simply a collection of prisons. It is a labor economy, a system for converting the bodies of the condemned into productive output for the industrialization drive, and understanding it as an economic system rather than merely as a punishment. Apparatus reveals something important about the integration of terror and development in the Stalinist model. The Gulag administration, the chief administration of corrective labor camps, Gulag in its Russian acronym, is by the late 1930s one of the largest employers in the Soviet Union, responsible for a labor force that varies across the Stalin years, but that reaches approximately 1.5 to 2 million prisoners at its peak in the late Stalin period. These prisoners build canals. The White Sea-Baltic Canal, constructed in 1931 to 1933 with forced labor at a cost estimated at between 25,000 and 100,000 lives, is the most infamous. Build roads, railroads, and mines, cut timber in the far northern forests, extract gold and uranium and coal in conditions that make survival dependent on the specific assignment in the specific season in the specific competence of the camp administration. The Kolyma region of northeastern Siberia is the Gulag's most extreme environment in the setting for some of its most documented horrors. Kolyma is gold country, remote beyond almost any other inhabited region on Earth, with winter temperatures that regularly fall to -40 or 50 degrees Celsius, a growing season of perhaps 6 to 8 weeks per year, and no infrastructure of any kind when the first labor columns arrive in 1932. The prisoners who are sent to Kolyma are sent because they have gold quotas to meet, and the gold quotas take priority over everything else in the camp administration's calculations, because the gold is required for the hard currency that buys the Western machinery that the 5-year plan requires. The system by which prisoners work themselves to death in Kolyma is documented in extraordinary detail by the writer Varlam Shalamov, who spent 17 years in the Kolyma camps, and who wrote about the experience in the stories collected as the Kolyma Tales. One of the supreme works of 20th century literature, written with a precision and a restraint that the subject seems to require of the honest witness. Shalamov describes the physical process of starvation under labor, the specific stages by which the body consumes itself when the caloric intake is insufficient to sustain the work the camp administration requires, the way that the reduction in ration for failure to meet the daily work quota produces the further reduction in productive capacity that makes the next day's quota even less achievable, the deliberate mathematical structure of a system in which the minimum ration is set below the maintenance caloric level, so that the prisoner is always getting weaker, always falling further behind, always producing less, always receiving less. This is not accidental. The minimum ration in the harshest camp regimes is set below the maintenance level deliberately, as a matter of policy, because the labor force is renewable from the arrests that are continuing across the country, and because the cost of maintaining a prisoner above the maintenance caloric level is a cost that can be avoided. The prisoner is a unit of labor with a limited productive life, and the camp system is designed around the exploitation of that productive life at minimum cost, with replacement from the continuing flow of arrests when the unit's productive life is exhausted. This is the economic logic of the Gulag. It is the logic of a system that regards human beings as resources and that manages those resources with the same calculation that a mine operator applies to a seam of coal. Extract the maximum value at minimum cost. Replace when exhausted. Do not invest in maintenance beyond what is necessary for extraction. The Katyn massacre of April and May 1940 is a specific event within the larger machinery of Stalinist terror that deserves its own examination, both because of its specific character and because of the extraordinary history of its denial, acknowledgement, and continuing political significance. In the autumn of 1939, following the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, police officers, intellectuals, professors, doctors, lawyers, priests, and landowners are taken prisoner by the NKVD. They are held in 3 camps, Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov. They represent, in significant part, the educated, professional, and military elite of the Polish state. The people who, if Poland were to survive the German and Soviet occupations and reconstruct itself as a functioning country, would provide the institutional knowledge and leadership necessary to do so. In March 1940, Beria sent Stalin a memorandum recommending that all 22,000 prisoners be shot. The rationale is their class background, their presumed hostility to the Soviet state, and the operational security consideration that these are people who, if released, would constitute a core of Polish national resistance. Stalin approves the memorandum. He initials it. He circulates it to the Politburo members who also approve it, their initials on the document alongside his. The executions are carried out in April and May of 1940. The prisoners from Kozelsk are shot in the Katyn forest near Smolensk. The prisoners from the other camps are shot at Kalenin and Kharkiv. They are killed by a shot to the back of the head in the standard NKVD execution method, their hands bound behind them with rope. They are buried in mass graves that the NKVD attempts to conceal and that the German army discovers in 1943 and that produces one of the most significant propaganda crises of the Second World War. The Germans announce the discovery to the world. The Polish government in exile in London requests an international Red Cross investigation, and the Soviet Union, which has been denying knowledge of the prisoners' whereabouts since 1941, when the Polish government first asked, denounces the German announcement as a fascist fabrication and breaks diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile for daring to request an investigation. The Nuremberg Tribunal, reviewing the evidence in 1946, declines to attribute the Katyn massacre to the Germans in its final judgment, a striking omission that reflects the political reality of the tribunal's composition and the Soviet Union's status as a prosecuting power. The Soviet Union maintains its denial until 1990, when Gorbachev formally acknowledges that the NKVD carried out the executions and apologizes to Poland. The documents authorizing the executions, Beria's memorandum, Stalin's initials, are released to the Polish government in 1992. The Katyn massacre is not the largest single atrocity of the Stalinist period. It is the most precisely documented in terms of the decision trail, and it is therefore the case that most clearly illuminates the relationship between the man at the top and the specific deaths at the bottom. The initials on the memorandum, the shots in the forest, the 22,000 Polish officers whose names are in the archives and whose descendants know what happened to them. Those initials are in the archive. They are in Stalin's handwriting. They are the signature of a man who reads a memorandum proposing the murder of 22,000 people and writes his agreement in the margin. That is the machine. That is its human form. That is what it looks like when the distance between the red pencil and the forest at Katyn is measured not in miles, but in the chain of institutional steps that connects them, each step normal and ordinary, and procedurally correct, each step performed by people who are doing their jobs. Joseph Stalin dies on March 5, 1953, in his dacha at Kuntsevo outside Moscow. He has suffered a stroke 2 days earlier, on the night of March 1st to 2nd, and lies on the floor of his private dining room for several hours before his guards find him, partly because his guards have been trained to never enter the room without being summoned, and partly because no one in the apparatus of the Soviet state, by 1953, is willing to make the decision to interrupt Stalin's sleep without his explicit permission, even when Stalin is lying incapacitated on the floor of his own dacha with blood on his face. He dies surrounded by the men who have survived his purges by serving him completely: Beria, Molotov, Khrushchev, Malenkov, and by the specific quality of fear that his presence generates even in his final incapacity. The doctors who are called to the dacha are new doctors, unfamiliar with Stalin's medical history, because most of Stalin's previous physicians have just been arrested in the doctor's plot, the latest eruption of Stalinist paranoia, in which a group of predominantly Jewish doctors had been accused of planning to murder Soviet leaders. The new doctors treat the dying man with the terrified incompetence of people who know that any decision they make can be construed as either negligence or deliberate harm, and that either charge, in this political context, means arrest. He dies, and for the several hours before his death is announced, the men around his deathbed watch him die with expressions that mix genuine grief with the specific relief of people who have been living under existential threat for so long that the removal of the threat produces a disorientation that must be carefully concealed. Beria is said to have been almost cheerful. The announcement of Stalin's death is met in the Soviet Union with something that contemporary Western observers find almost impossible to understand: genuine mass mourning. Crowds gather in Moscow. People weep in the streets. The funeral produces a crush of mourners so dense that dozens of people are killed in the crowd. These are not performances. These are not people who are coerced into displaying grief. These are people who have been shaped by 2.5 decades of propaganda that has made Stalin the father of the nation, the guarantor of victory in the war against fascism, the architect of Soviet modernization, and who feel in his death the loss of something that was genuinely central to their understanding of the world and their place in it. This is one of the most disturbing things about totalitarian systems. They can make the people within them genuinely love the thing that is destroying them. Not everyone, not all the time, but enough, often enough, to produce the crowds of genuine mourners at the funeral of the man who sent their fathers and brothers and husbands to the camps. The de-Stalinization that follows is cautious, self-interested, and incomplete in ways that matter for the Soviet Union's subsequent history. Khrushchev's secret speech to the 20th Party Congress in February 1956 is, by the standards of Soviet political culture, an extraordinary event. A senior party official, in a closed session of the Party Congress, explicitly denouncing the crimes of his predecessor, naming specific victims, describing specific atrocities, breaking the wall of silence that had surrounded the terror for 20 years. The speech is secret in the sense that it is not immediately published, but it is read to party organizations throughout the Soviet Union within weeks, and its contents filter out to the wider population and to the Western press within months. The speech matters. It produces what Khrushchev himself later calls the thaw, a genuine loosening of political repression, the release of millions of Gulag prisoners, the rehabilitation of some victims of the terror, the beginning of a public conversation about what had been done. Writers like Alexander Solzhenitsyn can publish work that describes the Gulag, the terror, the specific human experience of Stalinist repression. Not fully, not freely, and not without ongoing censorship and harassment, but in ways that were completely impossible under Stalin. The speech also has limits that are equally important. Khrushchev condemns Stalin's crimes, but he condemns them as deviations from correct Leninist policy, as the work of a single man's paranoia and cult of personality, not as the structural consequences of a one-party state, with a coercive apparatus and no institutional constraints. The system that Stalin built is not indicted by the secret speech. The party that enabled him is not indicted. The specific individuals who carried out the terror, who ran the interrogations, who signed the orders, who drove the prisoners to the execution sites at Butovo and Komunarka and Sandamok and the dozens of other places where the bodies were buried. These individuals are not put on trial. Most of them live out their lives in ordinary Soviet society. This is not unique to the Soviet case. It is the general pattern of political accountability for mass atrocity when the accountability is conducted by the successor state rather than by an external authority. The system is partially condemned, the leader is denounced, and the vast mid-level apparatus of implementation is quietly reabsorbed into the ordinary functioning of the continuing state. The Gulag system, which holds at its peak in the late Stalin period, perhaps 2 million prisoners. Historians debate the exact number, and the number changes significantly across the years of the purges and the war and the post-war period, is wound down after Stalin's death, not all at once and not without complications, but substantially. The millions of people released from the camps in the mid to late 1950s return to a Soviet society that does not, in most cases, know how to receive them. They are not acknowledged as victims of a crime for which anyone is accountable. They are released because Khrushchev has decided they should be released. They return to cities and villages where their apartments have been given to other families, where their professional positions have been filled, where their children have grown up without them and in many cases have been taught to believe that their parents were traitors. The rehabilitation process is real but inconsistent. Some victims are formally rehabilitated, their convictions posthumously overturned, their families given documents acknowledging the injustice of their treatment. Many are not. The children of the victims who were shot, who grew up in the specific hell of being the child of an enemy of the people. Excluded from education, excluded from party membership, carrying a stigma that the de-Stalinization does not fully remove, do not generally receive acknowledgement that anything was done to them at all. The specific human accounting of the Stalin period is still, in significant respects, unfinished. The archives of the NKVD were partially opened after 1991 and have provided historians with an unprecedented degree of access to the mechanics of the terror. The work of Memorial, the Russian human rights organization that spent decades documenting the victims of Soviet repression, building databases, collecting family testimonies, identifying burial sites, produced the most comprehensive accounting of what was done that any organization has yet achieved. Memorial was liquidated by court order in December 2021 on the grounds that it had violated foreign agent legislation. The databases survive, imperfectly, in fragments. The figure of Stalin in contemporary Russian political culture is one of the most revealing indicators of where that culture stands in its relationship to its own history. Repeated surveys over the last 2 decades have found that significant proportions of the Russian population regard Stalin positively, as an effective wartime leader, as the man who modernized the Soviet Union, as the figure who built a state that won the greatest war in history. The specific crimes of the terror are known in the abstract and are not generally denied, but they are compartmentalized, placed in a bracket labeled necessary costs of the historical project or attributed to the excesses of subordinates in ways that allow the positive assessment of the leader to coexist with the acknowledgement of specific atrocities. This is not unique to Russia. It is the general form that the political memory of authoritarian modernizers takes when the modernization is genuine and the atrocities are also genuine. A population that benefited from the modernization and that does not want to conclude that the benefit was built on an unjust foundation finds ways to maintain both facts simultaneously by insisting that the costs and the benefits were in some sense separable, that the industrialization could have been achieved without the famine, or the famine was the fault of the peasants' resistance, or the terror was a product of wartime necessity and foreign encirclement, or that the scale of the crimes has been exaggerated by enemies of Russia. The victims of the Stalinist system do not have the option of this compartmentalization. The families of the 22,000 Polish officers and intellectuals shot at Katyn in April and May of 1940, an atrocity that the Soviet Union denied for 50 years, and that Russia acknowledged only in 1990, and that has remained a source of profound tension between Russia and Poland in the decades since, do not have the option of deciding that the historical significance of the Soviet modernization projects outweighs the significance of what happened in the forest at Katyn. The children of the Ukrainian families that survived the Holodomor do not have the option of deciding that the collectivization of agriculture was a necessary historical step and that the famine was a regrettable cost. The famine is not a historical abstraction to them. It is the death of great-grandparents and grandparents, the specific named losses that families carry in the way that violent death always marks a family. In the gaps, the silences, the stories that are told, and the stories that cannot be told. Anya Voronova, not a historical figure, but the composite of thousands of documented real ones, does not appear in the history books. Her family's grain quota does not appear in the official statistics of the Soviet industrialization. The letter that arrived at her kitchen table on a Tuesday in February 1932 is not in the archives. But the system that produced the letter is in the archives in extraordinary detail, and the system reveals that Anya Voronova's Tuesday morning, the freezing apartment, the 2 potatoes, the NKVD officers in the street below, was not an anomaly or a malfunction, but a design. It was the system operating as intended. The system was designed by a man in Moscow, reading grain quota reports by red pencil light in the small hours of the morning. A man who had once been a boy named Yoseb Yugashvili in a Georgian town called Gori, beaten by his father, shaped by a seminary, hardened by a decade of revolutionary underground life, and transformed by the revolution into something that the boy in Gori could not have imagined. The person with absolute authority over the lives of 140 million people, reading their reports, marking the numbers that fall short of the plan, writing the directives that will close the distance between the plan and the reality by the only method he has ever believed in: force. The system is still running. The red pencil marks the page. The dispatch arrives at the district committee. The letter is written. The envelope is sealed. The postman delivers it on a Tuesday. In a freezing apartment in Leningrad, a woman opens it. She already knows what it says. The question of historical memory and accountability for Stalinist crimes is a question that the Russian state has been navigating with varying degrees of honesty and avoidance since 1953. and the trajectory of that navigation is itself a lesson in how states manage the relationship between historical truth and national identity. The Khrushchev period represents the high watermark of Soviet self-examination in this regard. The secret speech is real. The thaw is real, the release of millions of Gulag prisoners is real, and the specific changes in Soviet cultural life that the thaw produces. The literature, the cinema, the relative loosening of censorship in the late 1950s and early 1960s are genuinely significant. Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, published in Novi Mir in 1962, with Khrushchev's personal approval, brings the Gulag into official Soviet literary culture for the first time and produces a cultural event whose significance in the Soviet Union of 1962 is almost impossible to exaggerate. Ordinary Soviet readers encountering, in a literary form sanctioned by the state that had created the camps, a detailed, honest account of what those camps were like. But the Khrushchev thaw has structural limits that become apparent as soon as it begins. The limits are not primarily the limits of Khrushchev's personal courage or commitment. They are the limits of what an examination of Stalinist crimes can produce without also examining the system that made those crimes possible. If you take the critique of Stalin's crimes seriously, you are forced to ask about the party that enabled him, about the subordinates who signed the orders, about the ideological framework that justified the terror, about the institutional structure that prevented effective resistance, about the economic system that produced the famine. None of these questions can be asked honestly without producing answers that threaten the legitimacy of the Soviet state itself, which is why the Khrushchev thaw is a thaw and not a reckoning. It criticizes the cult of personality, not the party. It rehabilitates some victims, not the system that victimized them. It releases the prisoners, but it does not call what happened to those prisoners a crime for which anyone is accountable. The Brezhnev period that follows the removal of Khrushchev in 1964 reverses even this limited degree of self-examination. The rehabilitation of Stalin, not complete, not official, but perceptible in the gradual disappearance of his name from the category of people who could be criticized, in the rehabilitation of his historical reputation as a wartime leader, in the rehabilitation of the victory of 1945 as a Stalinist achievement whose costs could not be examined without undermining the achievement, becomes a feature of late Soviet political culture. The writers and historians who continue to investigate the terror are harassed, their works suppressed, Solzhenitsyn expelled from the country in 1974 after the publication of the Gulag Archipelago in the West. The Gulag Archipelago is the monument of this period in terms of historical documentation. 3 volumes constructed from 227 testimonies gathered by Solzhenitsyn over decades of clandestine effort, presenting the Gulag not as an aberration in Soviet history, but as its structural feature, the logical extension of the Leninist approach to governance into the Stalinist application of that approach. The book is dangerous in the Soviet Union not primarily because it reveals facts that were unknown. Most of the facts were known in outline, if not in detail, to most people who had lived through the 1930s and 1940s. But because it presents those facts within a framework of analysis that attributes them not to the personal pathology of a single leader, but to the system itself. This is the analysis that the Soviet state could not permit, because it implies that the system, not merely the man, was the problem. And if the system was the problem, the solution is not de-Stalinization. The solution is something more fundamental. The period following 1991 produces an extraordinary flowering of historical investigation into the Stalin years. driven by the partial opening of Soviet archives, the work of organizations like Memorial, and the intellectual energy of historians who spent the Soviet period working around censorship and who are now able to work with the documentary record directly. The result, over the subsequent 3 decades, is the most detailed account of the Stalinist system that has been assembled. The specific numbers, the specific mechanisms, the specific names of the victims and the perpetrators, reconstructed from the files that the NKVD kept on its own operations with the bureaucratic thoroughness of an institution that believed it was building the future and wanted the future to know what it had done. The Butovo firing range, south of Moscow, is one of the most significant of the documented execution sites. Between 1937 and 1938, more than 20,000 people are shot there and buried in mass graves that are discovered only after the Soviet Union's collapse. The site has become, in the post-Soviet period, a place of commemoration. The Russian Orthodox Church has built a church there, memorial services are held, the names of the known victims are read aloud. The site is accessible to the public. Families come to it. The Sandamok forest in Karelia is another. More than 9,000 people are shot and buried there between 1937 and 1938, including a large number of representatives of the Karelian, Finnish, and Polish intelligentsia. Memorial's work identified and documented many of these victims before the organization's liquidation in 2021. The site is marked. The Kommunarka estate south of Moscow is a third. The private dacha of Yagoda, the first head of the NKVD in the terror years, converted into an NKVD shooting ground after his arrest, where senior victims of the terror, party officials, military commanders, scientists, writers, were executed and buried. The site is now also a place of commemoration. These sites are the physical remainder of what the red pencil produced. They are the other end of the administrative chain that begins with a directive from the Politburo and ends with a shot to the back of the head in a forest clearing. They are the places where the abstraction of the quota becomes specific and irreversible. This person, in this place, on this date. The work of documenting them is the work of insisting that the abstraction be refused, that the numbers be disaggregated back into names, that the names be attached to stories, that the stories be held by the people who come after. Memorial did this work for 30 years. Its liquidation by the Russian state in 2021, justified on a technical legal pretext that everyone understood to be a political decision, is itself a statement about the relationship between the current Russian state and the history that Memorial was documenting. The statement is, this history is not ours to acknowledge. The acknowledgement is dangerous to the political project. The political project is a project that requires a version of Russian history in which the state is the protagonist of a great national destiny, in which the costs of that destiny are regrettable necessities rather than deliberate crimes, in which the victims are footnotes to the achievement rather than the primary evidence about what the achievement actually was. Anya Voronova is a footnote in this version of history. 2 potatoes in a cold pot. A letter from the district committee. A woman at a window watching the stout man from the bread depot walk around the corner with the NKVD officers. She's not a footnote in the other version of history, the version that Memorial was building and that survives in pieces in the archives and the testimonies and the names read aloud at Butovo on the anniversaries. In that version, she is the story. The man in Moscow with the red pencil is the machine. She is the reason the machine cannot be the only story. Joseph Stalin signs his initials in the margin. The dispatch goes out. The letter arrives. The pot is on the stove. The children are hungry. The mother stirs. She is still stirring. She is still here. Remember her. The question that remains, the question that every episode in this series ultimately returns to, because it is the question that the history keeps posing and that we keep failing to answer definitively, is the question of ordinary participation, not the question of Stalin. Stalin is accountable, and his accountability is established in the documentary record with a specificity that leaves no serious room for argument. The initials are his. The directives are signed. The execution lists carry his name. He knew, he decided, he continued. The question is, the NKVD officer who conducted the interrogations, who knew what the interrogation was for and conducted it anyway. The question is the regional party secretary who submitted the arrest quota, knowing it would be filled with people who had done nothing, because submitting a lower number would raise questions about his revolutionary vigilance. The question is the collective farm chairman who reported a neighbor for hiding grain, knowing that the report would result in the neighbor's arrest, because the neighbor's arrest might forestall his own. The question is the factory director who signed the document certifying that the labor of Gulag prisoners had met the production standard when the labor had met the production standard because the people who failed to meet it had been shot. All of these people made choices. None of them are Stalin. All of them are part of the machine. The answer to the question of ordinary participation is not that the ordinary participants were monsters. The answer is more disturbing, that the system was designed to make ordinary participation rational, that the choices were structured so that participation was safe and refusal was dangerous, that the people who refused, who hid the neighbor, who understated the quota, who refused to sign the false certificate, were people of genuine moral courage, who paid genuine costs for that courage, and who represent a real but limited alternative to the dominant pattern. The dominant pattern is accommodation. The accommodation is rational. The rationality is the system's achievement. This is what Stalin built. Not simply a terror apparatus, but a moral environment in which the terror apparatus seemed, to the people inside it, like the natural and necessary feature of the world they were living in. An environment in which the question of whether to comply with the system's demands was replaced, for most people, by the question of how to comply in ways that minimized the personal cost. The people who refused, the people who said, in various ways, that they would not participate even at personal cost, are the evidence that the compliance was not inevitable, that human beings within this system retained enough moral agency to choose otherwise, and that choosing otherwise was possible even when it was dangerous. They are, in their refusal, the refutation of the system's claim to total control over the human beings within it. But the refusal is rare enough that it cannot be the primary story. The primary story is the accommodation. The primary story is the rational calculation in a structured choice. The primary story is the NKVD officer conducting the interrogation and the factory director signing the certificate and the party secretary submitting the quota, each of them making the choice that the system rewards and surviving to make it again the following week. The primary story is the system, and the system runs on ordinary human beings doing ordinary things within an extraordinary moral environment. This is what we are still learning, long after the red pencil stopped moving. This is what Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, Yosef Yugashvili, the cobbler's son from Gori, the seminary dropout, the professional revolutionary, the man who named himself Steele, left behind when his body was placed in the Lenin mausoleum in 1953 and when it was removed from the mausoleum in 1961 and buried in a modest grave near the Kremlin wall. Not the grave, not the body. The lesson,